can we get permission to build those power lines and pipelines to get those new cleaner energy sources to market?
How that might change from administration to administration.
Roughly 13 gigawatts of wind and solar projects have been canceled because of the administration's policies. And this is occurring at a point when we have rising prices of electricity.
The federal government should have more authority to approve energy projects that cross state lines, or less authority.
They just have so many mechanisms that they can put in place to just slow processes down.
We need to move to a different equilibrium where it's much easier to build some of these power lines.
What they're most, of course, concerned about is some form of injunctive relief, which would hold up a project.
Hey everybody, and welcome to Power Perspectives. I'm Kinsey Grant Baker. Let's have some fun today. So the truth of the matter is this. The clean energy transition is hitting a bottleneck, not in technology, not in funding, but in permitting. From transmission lines to wind farms, the US is struggling to approve energy projects fast enough to meet demand. We're currently working with a slow and complex and costly system, one that often generates more delays and cost increases than it does delivered electrons. So if we know that clean, reliable, and affordable energy requires better infrastructure, and we know that better infrastructure requires more streamlined permitting, how do we make it happen? That is what we are covering in today's conversation: the roots of the permitting problem, where reform efforts stand today, and how the United States can strike the right balance on speed, accountability, and local control. We're doing it with two celebrated experts on the topic: James Coleman, professor of law at the University of Minnesota, and David Adelman, professor of law at the University of Texas. Both James and David have worked extensively on permitting on issues like this for some time now. They have a whole slew of ideas on how to make the system work better. Some they agree on, some they might not. So today, we're going to explore the best paths to take to get out of this permitting purgatory. James, David, how are you? Welcome to Power Perspectives.
Doing great. Thank you. Great to be here.
Great to be here talking with you guys.
Yeah, I'm super excited for this conversation. And as our listeners can surmise after that introduction and hearing multiple voices, we have two guests on the show today. So as a means of a quick introduction, and so our listeners know whose voice is whose, can you tell me how you got into the energy sector? David, you want to kick us off?
Sure. I mean, I'm predominantly trained as an environmental lawyer, and that's what I practiced. But there's little division these days between, environmental law and energy policy, especially around issues of climate change. So I've, gradually over time looked at issues around environmental litigation, both as they apply to energy, but also beyond that. And then more recently focused on empirical studies of permitting and litigation of infrastructure, and again, particularly wind and solar projects. So I'm increasingly interested in that, and also increasingly interested in permitting, not just at the federal level, but also at the local level.
Yes, and both of which I am certain we will talk about today. James, what about you? How'd you get into this field?
Yeah, so I'm one of those odd people that always knew I wanted to be a professor. I wasn't sure of what. And my background is in science. I did genetics, biology, animal behavior, and but I decided I wanted to be working on something with a little bit more policy relevance. So when I went to law school, I was looking for a topic that incorporated science, and as David suggests, I think energy and environmental are two very closely related disciplines that are in that area. And so I really enjoyed the energy work that I did as a lawyer in DC for Sidley Austin for a few years, but kind of pursued my dream of becoming a law professor. And so once I entered academia, started writing pretty quickly about an issue that really over the course of my career, right from 2008 until now, has just been growing in importance over time, which is, how do we build new infrastructure? How do we think about, manage and minimize the environmental cost of infrastructure and of the energy system? And so that's my path into energy and infrastructure policy.
Yeah, I dig it. And I think hearing both of your answers on this first question, to me, really, tease up why I'm excited to have two law professors on the show to talk about permitting, because so much of this is intersectional with other issues that are either directly or tangentially related to many of the big topics we talk about on a show called Power Perspectives about the energy and utility industries. So much of this is interconnected and has a lot of tentacles in all sorts of different spots. So I'm excited to kind of unwind this with the two of you. And I think now that we're better situated with who's who on the show here today, I want to start by establishing sort of the scope of this challenge, this permitting challenge, and setting the stakes for people listening, for utility leaders, for policymakers. So can you start by just telling me a little bit more about why permitting reform has really become one of these defining issues for energy infrastructure today? Can we start with defining the problem?
Sure. James, do you want to start? Because I
Yeah,
think
yeah. No,
we have
I think
quite different views on that question. So, but I
yeah,
think it'd be good for you.
that may be. So the way I think about it is that the energy sources that built the modern world, modern civilization, everything we see around us, all the ways that over the last 150 years we've reduced poverty or come up with new technologies, etc. Mostly we're talking about coal and oil. And coal basically allows us to gather a lot of energy in cities, to power industry, to power electricity. And oil is that sort of very energy dense source that you can carry with you, and so it enables global transport. So planes, yeah, trains, automobiles, all of that, and so it enables a globally interconnected economy. The downside of coal and oil is that they're dirtier to build, and so sorry, dirtier to burn. Um, the upside and what made them so transformative for the world is that they're easy to transport and store. And in fact, transport and storage of energy is what makes it affordable, that reliable in the sense that you can count on it being there and secure. Because basically, if there's a shortage in one place, you just take energy from where you have extra of it and transport it over there. And if you anticipate potential shortages in the future, you can store it up. And oil and coal are both very easy for that because you can ship it by so many different methods. It's very relatively easy to store. I mean, the US basically has salt caves where we store more than a month of oil supply, just the government does. And so they're very cheap and easy. When you come to the sort of cleaner energy sources that we are using more and more of and would be beneficial to use even more of, like natural gas, like renewables, they're very limited in how they can be transported and stored. And so, basically, if you're talking about natural gas, if you're sending it overland, you're talking about the steel pipelines could be multi-billion dollars, very expensive. If you're talking about electricity from renewable energy, or geothermal, many of these new sources that we'd like to develop more of, again, the only method for transporting it is a multi-billion dollar power line. And so as a result, um, the focus of energy law has changed a lot from the days when energy meant oil and coal. And the basic challenge with energy was, could you get these out of the ground affordably? Nowadays, we're talking about a lot. When we're talking about energy, we're talking about natural gas, we're talking about renewables. And with those sources, that natural gas is often very cheap or even free at the wells where it's produced. And that renewable energy, again, very cheap or even free in the places that it's produced. So when you pay for electricity that's come from renewable and natural gas, or when you pay for natural gas, you're not really paying mostly for the cost of extracting that energy from the wind or from the well. You're mostly paying for the cost of getting it to you. And so that's why all of a sudden, as our energy system is transitioning to more dependence on these cleaner sources, we've also found a lot of pressure on, can we get permission to build those long interjurisdictional, typically, power lines and pipelines to get those new cleaner energy sources to market. And so that's what I think. I mean, if frankly, pipelines used to be very boring. When I started out my career again in 2008, that was when the Keystone XL pipeline was proposed, and I think you can tell how boring pipelines were, that they called it XL. I mean, they were not worried about attention on this project. They were like, we're making multi-billion-dollar investments here. Nobody cares. Look, this is XL. It's huge, right? Nowadays, if you build a pipeline, some of the recent controversies have been about, like, the Constitution pipeline, right? Who could object? Who could object to that, right? They all have names that are much more aware of the fact that they might get some attention. But that's a relatively recent development. Historically, I think power lines and pipelines, that those big interjurisdictional energy projects were kind of a backwater of energy law, and they've increasingly become central. And so that's put a huge focus on permitting, because those big projects are just much harder to permit, because you're typically going to need approval from a lot of different authorities. And sometimes there's going to be questions about, well, what's the real benefit to me of this power line coming across my state if the wind's being produced in a different state and the power is mostly being consumed in a state on the other side of me?
That's great. I think that's a really nice context, and I'll more sort of talk about it in a maybe in a complementary way. Um, I mean, the shift that James is just talking about is absolutely critical. Kind of the nature of the infrastructure that we're building for the energy sector has changed, and it's not like we weren't building pipelines before, but that's just become a much more important and acute issue. And then the same with transmission, where we're going to have to like double, maybe even triple the amount of transmission lines that are required to decarbonize the economy. And then along with that, huge amount of generation. Renewables will be a significant component of that. Geothermal is sort of rising in relative importance, or there's a lot of hope around that too. And from a regulatory perspective, if we're just sort of focusing on the federal level, they're really challenging regulatory questions that are raised by large infrastructure. Um, and the agencies, sort of the information available on endangered species issues, impacts on wetlands. I think the sort of nature of the regulatory process has also shifted from like a lot of Clean Air Act, maybe Clean Water Act permitting, to permitting that's really mostly focused on kind of wildlife issues and land impact issues. And sort of the capacities in that area, I think, aren't as great as under the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. Um, and I think some of the technical and scientific questions around it are also harder ones too.
Mhm.
So the sort of shift that James is talking about, there's kind of a regulatory component to that as well that has kind of made things more challenging. And then if you think about the scale and the rapidity of deployment that we're requiring right now, that just alone is going to put pressure on permitting and regulators. And that's ignoring what's going on at the local level altogether.
Yeah, and we'll talk some too about what is going on at the local level, and as you mentioned, James, the interjurisdictional nature of all of this. But before we get into that, David, I want to hear just a little bit more about this intersection of, balancing environmental protections with core and necessary infrastructure build out. A lot of the conversation around permitting challenges has to do with, as you mentioned, some of these important and landmark pieces of legislation or lawmaking that has happened in past decades. One that certainly comes to mind when we're talking about permitting, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. These are specifically built to be speed bumps, right? They're supposed to slow down the process a little to ensure that certain things happen or don't happen, to my understanding. But I'm curious if this balance between protecting the environment, protecting the world, protecting species, et cetera, with building out this infrastructure is possible. Can we have both? Is that something that is likely or realistic?
I mean, I think to realize is modern federal environmental laws have been in place for roughly 50 years. We've built a lot, not necessarily, a huge amount of energy infrastructure, but a lot of other things like other infrastructure like roads and residential development that implicate these statutes as well. And so, one thing to appreciate is there are streamlined processes under the Endangered Species Act. There are shorter processes under the National Environmental Policy Act that you can go through. So the environmental impact statement is like the full-blown environmental review under the statute. Even though we are a larger country and we continue to build things and make, myriad decisions that impact the environment, the actual number of EISs has been declining for literally for decades. So like the last few years, the number of EISs prepared across the entire federal government has been fewer than 100. And you can imagine there are literally thousands, tens of thousands of decisions that implicate NEPA. And so the vast majority of decisions are falling under what are referred to as environmental assessments, which is sort of a shorter version of an environmental impact statement that's designed to determine whether environmental impacts are significant. Typically, those are conducted in about a year, and then many, many more, like I don't know, 95% fall under what are referred to as categorical exclusions, which are kind of regulatory exemptions from the NEPA process. So, the short answer is this is an issue. This sort of balance is an issue that arises across multiple environmental statutes. Different statutes have different mechanisms in place to provide for streamlined processes and reviews, and we can query whether or not those are sufficiently quick and efficient, but that balance is routinely struck and managed under really almost all of the major environmental statutes. There's some outliers, but virtually all of them have variants of this in them.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. And it brings to mind for me how that might change from administration to administration. Certainly in the second Trump administration over the last several months, we've seen a lot of headlines, more than I'm sure many average, everyday, non utility people are used to consuming about energy infrastructure. So, what has changed under this current administration? And how might any new sort of procedural bottlenecks might those affect the projects that we currently have in the works or need to have in the works, soon. And I would be curious to hear both of your perspectives on this one.
So a lot has changed. And let me start. I wanted to underline a point that David made, which is just that the scale of how we're going to have to change how we're building infrastructure is truly massive. I think that I know David and I are often reading many of the same studies. So I think there was a study from this Princeton project that basically suggested under the Inflation Reduction Act, with if we were going to get all the development that we were hoping for under that act that we really counted on when we passed those subsidies for solar and wind energy, basically you would need to have about, I think, three times the rate of power line construction. But to something that David mentioned there, which is that unfortunately, actually, if you look at our power line construction over time, it continues to go down. So if you look at recent years, the most recent years, that's basically a 10x in the rate of power line construction. So if you average over the last 15 years, yeah, maybe it's a 2 or 3x. So it's basically there needs to be just a truly somewhat drastic change in how quickly we build some of this infrastructure. And if you were hopeful that, well, we've struck a balance before, we'll strike a balance in the future, and we can adapt. I do think that like one place that I lived for many years, and David lives, Texas, has been very effective at building projects relatively, very sometimes ahead of time, which is very unusual for the rest of the country. And I think there's a lot of potential reasons for that. Some of the people who studied it, say some of it has to do with basically they just have enough engineers working in the government that basically can approve, can help get those projects through. But to some extent, that shows that, I think permitting is kind of like a muscle where if you don't use it, you lose it. And if you do use it, it's like you've been, if this is the first, power line that's come across there's of course dozens of people that have to give approvals. But if it's the first power line that you've seen in 20 years, maybe it takes you a while to get up to speed on like what exactly is the decision I'm supposed to make here. Whereas if you're approving, one every other month, it's much easier to make that decision. And that has a number of knock-on effects. I mean, Texas, for instance, has been way more successful than anywhere else in the country in adding renewable power to the grid. And one reason for that is, basically for those solar and wind facilities don't wait so long to receive permission to connect to the grid, that sort of transmission interconnect process, because they use a connect and manage approach. Well, I think a lot of people in other parts of the country would be afraid of a connect and manage approach because they don't have the same kind of confidence that, like, well, if we need to build more power line, hey, we can build it, right there. So, I think David and I probably agree that basically there's we need to move to a different equilibrium where it's much easier to build some of these power lines, and this, sort of we're focused on how we can get to this equilibrium. Now, in terms of what's changed in the administration, I mean, so a lot, some of what's changed is changing the opposite. I mean, things are slowing down in the sense that, not only, um, I mean, of course, some of the subsidies for solar and wind are now on a gradual phase out. They've been scheduled to phase out before, sometimes come back. We'll see what happens with that, but they may be gone. I think with or without them, you'd still get some solar and wind. But I think the more concerning thing is that you've had just like, when there's been permits that required federal review, those have been delayed and pulled sometimes. And so that just introduces another element of uncertainty, and when we're talking about trying to make these massive capital investments, any kind of uncertainty, like the government just might kill your project at any time, is particularly difficult. Particularly when we've seen those timelines, because they have stretched out somewhat. Usually, it's not that you're not going to be able to propose, basically to plan, propose, and build a project all within one administration. If we're talking about a power line, David's done work. The solar and wind facilities themselves individually, that could be, you could do that on a much faster time scale. That's not the kind of linear interjurisdictional project where these permitting problems are so harsh. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that's introduced a lot of uncertainty. There's been a number of things, and maybe I'll let David talk about these. There were a number of changes as well to the NEPA regulations, as well as we've had an important court decision on the National Environmental Policy Act and the Seven County infrastructure case.
The changes have been very strong thumb on the scale in favor of fossil fuels, across the board with regard to permitting, um, and systematic obstruction and cancellation of especially wind projects, particularly offshore wind projects, but both wind and solar projects. So one recent study I read was roughly 13 gigawatts of wind and solar projects have been canceled because of the administration's policies, often withdrawing or pausing permits, sometimes withdrawing or holding up projects that are in the construction phase. So long after they've actually received all of their permits. The other thing that the administration is doing, just to give you an example, is within the Department of Interior, which is really critical because the Fish and Wildlife Service is there. It covers a lot of federal land. Um, any kind of decision related to a wind or solar project has to go up through 3 levels of political appointees and go ultimately through the secretary's office. Totally unprecedented. It's not clear that any projects have gone through that process yet. Clearly just blatant obstruction. And this is occurring at a point when we have rising prices of electricity, increasing demand, and the fastest generation that you can put on the grid, other than maybe storage, which isn't really generation, is really wind and solar, and particularly solar. So very deeply counterproductive. The issues around NEPA have mostly been, first of all, the Council on Environmental Quality regulations for NEPA covered all federal agencies. Those regulations were withdrawn. We're at a stage where we have, in essence, guidance with regard to regulations that individual agencies are going to are going to be adopting for implementing NEPA. It's an immensely sort of chaotic and uncertain state of actually implementing the statute. I think the objective of the administration is to minimize public processes, minimize requirements for EISs, and streamline NEPA as much as possible. And so just through regulations, it's dramatically altering how the statute is actually implemented.
Yeah. And, knowing that there are so many numerous idiosyncrasies for this administration specifically, pairing that reality with the picture that the two of you are painting of this need for drastic change at the permitting level to happen to build out the grid that we need. I'm curious what some of the possible paths forward are, what some of the solutions are. And one that I would love to hear your perspective on is whether, the federal preemption versus local control conversation is certainly interesting here. And this sort of tees up this idea of how far reform should go. So with this idea in mind, as you just mentioned, of the changes, the significant changes since the Trump administration took over office in January, do you think that the federal government should have more authority to approve energy projects when it comes to those projects that cross state lines, or less authority? And James, we can start with you. What do you think about that one?
I think that if we want to move to a system where it's easier to build infrastructure, we have more stable approvals, etc. I think there would be some advantages to have a system where either the federal government or the states got to make a decision on projects, but not necessarily all of those parties had the ability to veto projects. And that's kind of where we are now, is that it's not really a question of do you want it to be more federal or more state? Because the sort of status quo is, generally speaking, it's not that hard to veto the project if you don't like it, whether you're a state that doesn't like it or whether you're the federal government and doesn't like it. And that's actually been the result of sort of an evolution in legal strategies over a while. Because if you had asked people,
Yeah.
if you had asked, I mean, certainly if you asked people 20 years ago and you'd said, okay, if you want an approval as a natural gas pipeline, how do you get that approval? And they would say, well, for an interstate project, these big projects that we're talking about, you just need an approval from the federal government. You don't need state approval. But the issue is that, and if you had asked them, well, what if I want a power line or an oil pipeline? They would say, okay, well, those two, you don't need federal approval. You need approval from all the states. And that was kind of, for a long time, the way people in a shorthand manner describe the process. But over time, it's evolved. And what we've seen is a couple things. So one is for these natural gas pipelines that do receive their approval from the federal government, states have been able to use other statutes that require their input into the federal laws, like the Coastal Zone Management Act, the Clean Water Act 401, to stop those projects if they don't like them. And so that's created a situation where, I think a lot of times and it's a review, it's a reform I proposed. I think for some of the key power lines that we need, in the national interest, I do think that maybe you should be able to just you should be able to get a federal permit. My concern is that, like, if that's the only change that you make, if you don't change something that prevents states using other authorities to get the veto, they still might see state vetoes under other projects, just like we've seen in the natural gas pipelines. Then what about for the ones that are approved state by state? Well, there we're talking about oil pipelines and we're talking about power lines. Also carbon pipelines, couple other things, right? For those projects, historically would have said, no, you just need your state approval. But in practice, because of, I would say savvy litigation strategies using the National Environmental Policy Act, you've seen more and more cases where courts have said, well, actually, we need a full federal review of this project as well, because it has an impact on a federal waterway, could have an impact on cultural resources, etc. And so David and I may differ on this. I just, because I would like to push things towards a little bit, making it a little bit easier to permit some of these projects, I would rather have one level of review, whether it's, and then of course there should still be state input, but not a state veto on, federally necessary projects, right? And of course, how you define that is difficult. Now, there's a second question you're asking, which is a very difficult question that I hope we get to talk about here, because frankly, there hasn't been much consideration of it yet, which is how do we constrain arbitrary federal authority if these projects are just going to take, inherently are going to take more than a single administration to build? How do we prevent, I mean, we've seen this. I mean, how many times do we see that with Keystone XL, right? One administration kills it, next administration approves it, next administration kills it, next administration. I mean, now they're trying to get them to build it again, even though TC Energy has said they don't want it anymore. I mean, I think this is a big frustration for Congress as well. So I would hope that a permitting bill that comes out of Congress would address this. There has been, as David said, I mean, I think they are trying to see what they can do to speed up these NEPA reviews, but at the same time, there's been an effort to increase the ability of the administration to exercise arbitrary authority. And and unfortunately, I mean, I have to say, I think that's been kind of increasing over time. That's increased. That's a a long-term trend. I mean, you could go way back down to the Keystone XL pipeline, where the State Department said, "Well, this isn't going to harm climate change," and then President Obama said, "Well, but I still don't really like it." And so I think that's a but that that was very haphazard. That's just one thing. And now we're getting to the point where this is systematic, and it's basically being used to harm disfavored energy sources. We're going to be cut in a very, very bad equilibrium if the equilibrium is that, basically when we get a Republican president, they try and kill every, zero carbon project, and we get a Democratic president, they try to kill every fossil fuel project. That is a terrible place to be because it takes so long to build these. And as for all the reasons David said, we need all these projects. So, what I'm hopeful is that, I'm an optimistic person. So let me be optimistic for a second here. Maybe there's a negotiation move here, right? Which is basically to say, hey, we want Congress to pass some permitting reform. Until they do, we're going to exercise our arbitrary authority. I hope that the administration will not resist a bill that basically, that while it reforms permitting, also places some guardrails on the ability of the administration to just, withdraw those permits. And my understanding is that many of the permitting bills making their way through Congress try to address that problem by preventing you from, basically arbitrarily, revoking a permit. To me, that's a very modest benefit. I mean, it's a good benefit, it's a good thing, but it's a very modest benefit because that still doesn't deal with, like, well, how are they going to deal with new applications? And could we have a more, I don't know, technocratic process for those? And unfortunately, I mean, if you really want to get into the legal weeds, um, the Supreme Court is currently considering a number of changes to the law that would really weaken technocratic governance in general. And so I think this is one of the most challenging areas. How do we ensure some stability of federal policy? And I spent a lot of time brainstorming about this, but I haven't heard anything yet where I said, "Oh, that's a perfect solution."
I mean, to take this question first and then maybe talk a little bit about preemption. I think it's really difficult. I'm probably more pessimistic about the ability of any administration to hold up projects, in part because defining timelines is really challenging. They just have so many mechanisms that they can put in place to just slow processes down, that they don't have to even reject a process or take the more extreme measures that this administration has taken. Um, so I'm more pessimistic about the ability of Congress to kind of constrain that kind of discretion. I think to a very significant degree, we're reliant on the good faith of administrations to appropriately implement the laws that they have responsibility over. So I think it's a really genuinely hard question. I think it's an assumption of our uh, tripartite form of government is kind of good faith compliance to a significant degree. There's only so much that courts can do. There's only so much that Congress can do to check each other. If an administration is really committed to systematically pushing against the actual implementation of a law. And I think we've seen that not just in the permitting setting. We're obviously seeing that, really across the federal government in a whole variety of different contexts. So I share that concern. And I would even say, like, you're also, I think, fairly pointing to this sense that it's not just Republican administrations that do this. The type of compromise that you're talking about, um, I think is an interesting and important one. I'm not sure it's going to ultimately end up in guardrails, but maybe it will. The most important thing it can do is lead to kind of a de-escalation on both sides. And maybe it's sort of more of a political compromise rather than kind of a strict legal one. Um, I do want to say, with regard to NEPA litigation, one of my, deep frustrations is, for example, the SPEED Act which is probably the most prominent piece of legislation that's moving currently in Congress. One of its principal targets is limiting the remedies that are available when you challenge a NEPA decision in federal court. And what they're most, of course, concerned about is some form of injunctive relief, which would hold up a project. But if you look at NEPA litigation over the last 10 years, a very small percentage of projects, and this goes beyond just infrastructure projects, actually lead to any kind of injunctive relief. So it's about 7% of cases that have a NEPA claim in them lead to some form of injunctive relief. Even among the roughly third of cases where the plaintiffs prevail, and it's not a settlement, it's only about 1 in 5 cases that get any form of injunctive relief, and that's not necessarily a permanent injunction. Often that's, like, shorter term injunctive relief, and so the perception that courts aren't aware of and sensitive to mere technical challenges under the statute, and that they fail to craft relief that is consistent with that, I think is just wrong. And then if you look at, there's a recent couple of studies by Resources for the Future that covers wind and solar projects as well as geothermal projects between 2009 and 2023. They identified 2 solar projects and 2 wind projects developed over that entire period of time that they could say were terminated or delayed by litigation under NEPA. And so litigation under NEPA delayed less than 1% of projects. And so if you look at sort of the broad statistics, and this is like an independent study, it's not a study that I did, that is what they found. And they not only just looked at the litigation, they looked at processes preceding the litigation and looked deeply into how the litigation played out in each of those cases. So the concern that NEPA itself is this sort of kind of systematic structural barrier to development, it's just hard for me to see how those sorts of statistics support it. That doesn't mean that it can't be improved, but I feel like people generalize without really appreciating the actual data that we have.
Yeah, I think, David, this poses an interesting way of looking at the problem, that it's less about the law as it has been written and more about the way that legislators, regulators, the president are interpreting that law or interpreting their role in, making sure that that law comes to pass. So when it comes to an idea of a better future, this is obviously why we want to talk about permitting reform, because we want a reality in which projects can go from idea to execution faster than they do today. I'm curious what feels like it would make the most difference. A lot of this is, well, maybe Congress gives us reason for optimism when we're talking about that arbitrary authority. Maybe it doesn't. But what else could move the needle, I guess, is kind of what I'm scratching at here.
I think it's worth emphasizing how difficult this challenge is because at the end of the day, and frankly, this is how the affordability challenge works too, right? I mean, if you see 90, if anybody complains about affordability in anything, whether it's housing, food, energy, etc., like 95% of the proposals will be about like giving you money to do this or giving people money to produce those things. And of course, those don't actually make the things any more affordable in any sense, right? They simply are basically, okay, we'll take the money from your tax money, or we'll take or we'll and so they're not really affordability solutions. Like if you're looking to make some of these, if you want more energy availability, if you want, clean energy availability, if you want more housing, if you want more any of these things, unfortunately, you have to kind of do the hard, extremely hard work of finding out like what are the roadblocks and how can we potentially remove those roadblocks. And one of the things that makes that so very difficult is that it doesn't take very much to scare projects away because at the end of the day people are making massive multi-billion dollar huge capital investments, and it only pays off if everything goes right, and especially if you stack up those number of things. So a couple of things that I agree with David about there, and then maybe a couple of things I disagree with. So the projects that go through the full environmental impact statement are a tiny, tiny majority of all federal actions. I mean, of course, though, you have to think that in theory, this basically, if we're asking for a federal action that causes a significant impact on the environment, they the vast majority of those are covered by a categorical exclusion. Now, that categorical exclusion doesn't really exempt it from NEPA review. It just says that generally this project doesn't have significant impacts, and that can cover things as significant. I mean, that is seemingly significant as resurfacing the highway. Obviously there's machinery, et cetera, and it's just we say that there's not a significant impact from that. And that can cover things as really as trivial as like there's categorical exemptions for things like planting flowers by the side of the highway, putting signs up by the highway, calling meetings, hiring new staff. And so, because of course, there's thousands and thousands of those federal decisions every day, the vast majority of projects that in theory could be subject to NEPA are fall with under a categorical exemption exclusion. Not that you couldn't challenge them, but nobody would because they're tiny things. Unfortunately, although it is far fewer projects that go through the environmental impact statement or that go through an environmental assessment, which is that lower level of review, but then ultimately get challenged in court because people say they should have had an environmental impact statement. Those projects, although there's many fewer of them, and now it's under 100 per year, right? Those are typically very important projects. And so, David has done some of the most important work, and he cites one of the things I love is that we just keep getting more studies and more data, and this is great. So, David said like, well, this isn't my study, but if it was this study, I would love it. So like, so that shouldn't be that shouldn't be required advertising. And I mean, this is a great study shows is that yeah, there aren't actually um there's a lot. It's this environmental review of an individual solar and wind project. It's relatively unusual that it would. And David has shown as well that often it's just not subject. It basically doesn't get any, basically high level environmental review for these solar and wind projects. Now, there are two things about that. One is I'm not an investor, but if I were, it doesn't seem to me that I should be terrified of doing a project on federal land just because of NEPA. With that said, I think we've definitely seen a pattern of differential investment where investors are much more willing to invest on land that is not federal lands. And that has a huge impact given how much of the West is devoted to federal lands. So even though the risk may be relatively small of either NEPA or other federal statutes stopping these projects, it's a small risk can be enough to scare away capital investment. I should say the area that I would be concerned at if I was an investor and making investments would not really be on the solar wind farm side. It would be on the transmission side. I mean, I think for me, that's by far the biggest. And those are projects that quite likely to need an environmental impact statement. Sometimes even if you don't do one, the courts will require them, as we saw in that James River transmission case. And to me, the biggest bottleneck for more solar and wind is really about that long distance transmission. Some I know some people have a different model of the energy system where they're like, no, we're going to do it all rooftop and people are going to have their own batteries and we don't need such a big national grid. But I think, most of the modeling that says we're going to rapidly get a huge percentage of the grid onto renewables. I mean, and we're increasing it already, but I think, like the sort of high penetration of renewable scenarios, a lot of times require those interstate power lines. And I think those are the ones where, frankly, I can't give investors any comfort. I do really think that not just NEPA, but also state vetoes, Endangered Species Act, NHPA, a whole suite of statutes. And I don't, I agree we shouldn't over focus on NEPA. There's a many different problems, but I don't think we should throw away our, research or focus on reforming NEPA just because there are also many other problems. I mean, I guess the way, I remember the first house I bought, first big rainstorm, I got a bunch of water in it. I never figured out what was going on. I fixed the roof, I fixed the flashing, I fixed the stucco side, I fixed like 5 different things, and eventually the water stopped coming. Maybe there was one of those that I didn't actually need to fix to stop the water from coming in, but the reality is there's water coming in the house. Let's try and address each of the problems. And I don't think we're ever going to have a causal study that's going to say like, oh, it was fixing NEPA that got our infrastructure built faster, or it was fixing the NHPA. I mean, I think probably each of those problems are independently, sufficient to cause a significant amount of delay. And so reforming any one of them would be a necessary but not sufficient cause to actually getting to a faster process. I think anybody who works on optimizing the system, as soon as get the long pole out of the tent, you find the next longest pole, right? What's delaying us now? And so I think it's an important, I do think it's an important thing to continue focusing on. But I value, and I think there's a lot of good research on, it's not the only problem. And in fact, depending on what kind of project you're talking about, there's lots of projects where that's really not in their top 5 problems.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly, I mean, for transmission lines in particular, and I totally agree with you, that's often rate limiting. Like as so much infrastructure is, it's like having that infrastructure in place enables you, just like we've seen in Texas, to build a lot of new generation. But, in the case of transmission lines, so much of it is you've just got so many individual decision makers, and there are just so many potential blocks for projects. And then they're linear. Linear infrastructure is just like inherently so much harder because it goes through multiple jurisdictions and you have so many different decision makers. There, I would say, like the argument that NEPA is a major factor is questionable at best to my mind. Is can it be a contributing factor in certain cases? Certainly, but I don't think it's even remotely close to being rate limiting. You also sort of alluded to how, you would hope that developers and people financing these projects are rational in the way they evaluate the impact of NEPA and litigation risk. And I deeply, deeply share that concern. Like, these are people who say, criticize people on other grounds for not being rational. And I think if you actually look at the statistics, which we now have pretty good statistics, that they should recalibrate themselves in terms of, really the magnitude, significance of the risks associated with having to go through an environmental review and the risk of litigation. I just think that feels very much out of whack to me. Um, with regard to what we should, or could be doing more of, I think we have a really good model with the Fast 41 program, which was passed by Congress in 2015. And so it's been in place for roughly a decade. It's not perfect, but they were doing, just the hard administrative stuff, making sure that information is available both within the federal government and to project developers, um, tracking projects and having kind of developing performance indicators for permitting processes to not only ensure accountability, but also like figure out more precisely what is holding things up. Um, and then I would just say, interagency coordination, interjurisdictional coordination, between the federal and state governments. Um, the Permitting Council under Fast 41, with the projects that have gone through in that, they've been trying to develop models for that. That is the type of approach that strikes me that's really asking difficult, challenging, unsexy, unlitigation related questions that, if we really invested in it significantly, could have material benefits that would benefit all sorts of infrastructure and projects, not just in the energy sector.
Yeah, that's a great, a great note to begin to close this conversation with this idea that a lot of solving this problem that we started the conversation with is unsexy and complicated. There might not be the cool litigation, right? This requires a lot of brains to come together to figure something out. Many of the brains listening to this episode are people who work at utilities or work very closely with utilities. So before I let you go quickly here, I would love to just get a quick perspective on the utilities role in this. And maybe that role is nothing. Maybe it's more expectations that utilities and utility leaders should have for potential shifts in the permitting landscape. Can you tell me just a little bit about your view of how utilities fit into this conversation about permitting? David, you can kick us off quickly here.
I mean, I think they're really incredibly important. Um, And I mean, they just have so much expertise and experience with actually getting projects constructed And certainly for policymakers, for agency people, for local governments and state governments, having kind of a deeper understanding of how they look at project development and what matters to them, I think is incredibly important. I recently participated in a conference that really had a mix of people. It was government people, academics, NGOs, and a bunch of industry people too. And one of the issues that it seemed like there was like near unanimity on was the importance of the adequacy of agency resources and staffing. And industry people were really supportive of that because they understand um, that it's critical to have adequate staffing, adequate resources in the agency. They want those resources to be used efficiently, and they have lots of concerns and criticisms about that. But starving the agencies and firing people, we've gotten to a point where it just seems like there's sort of broad consensus that, at least in the agencies that I know of, there's deep, deep concern about how the actions that the current administration is taking.
Yeah, I would say that utilities have a natural role to play in arguing for consistent and non-arbitrary policy. So, yeah, I do think I agree with David. This is one of the most challenging things to provide, but utilities have a strong interest, and so they should be strong advocates for coming up with some mechanisms. Whether it's more decisions made by multi-member commissions, or some rules against withdrawing, or something. We've seen experimentation in different places with in housing, with the idea of permitting as a right for certain kind of projects. We've looked at idea that maybe you have to permit a certain number of interstate power lines, or et cetera. We've seen a lot of different approaches to trying to provide that kind of certainty. And so I just think that they should play an important role as advocates for more consistent non-arbitrary policy, and also in terms of helping to push out some ideas, because this is an area where we're in desperate need of more ideas. And the only other thing I would say is I deeply resent David's suggestion that fast 41, the permitting council, agency staffing are unsexy topics. Those are the most sexy topics there are. So I'm glad we came up in this discussion.
Yeah, heated debate to the last minute.
That's
Yeah, I think this is wonderful. It's a good note to end on. Utilities have a role to play here. The unsexy things are becoming sexy. Permitting is hot in 2026. So I'm sure this is a conversation that we will talk much, much more about. But David, James, thank you so much for joining me today on Power Perspectives to open the floor and start the conversation. As I mentioned, I'm sure this is something we'll return to time and again. But this has been just a really wonderful and context filled primer for me and for everybody listening. So I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks
Thank
so
you very
much,
much.
David.